Chapter 7. The heart knoweth his own bitterness, and a stranger doth not intermeddle with his joy. Proverbs 14:10. Over the next few weeks, it became apparent to those in the court that Solomon had ceased trimming his beard. A short while later, he was gently encouraged by his mother to get a haircut, which he declined without explanation. He went about his business as usual, effectively managing the kingdom and the building of the temple. But those who knew him sensed a different spirit about him. He was somber, morose, often found staring into space and avoiding participation in the normal feast and fanfare in which he had been known to make merry. Something was wrong. For all of Solomon's wisdom, his precise logic, and his incomparably ordered mind, the king was discovering that the deep well of emotion and passion that allowed him to write elegant songs and poetry also had a dark byproduct. He was capable of depression, and that of a depth not possible among men of ordinary mind. It was difficult, nay, impossible, it seemed, for him to shake himself of it. He spent more time in solitude so as not to trouble others with his own low spirits. He slipped away from the palace often to spend hours alone at the interesting new home he had been constructing on the far side of the grounds. There he could escape the constant questioning that pressed upon him. Hava had known that this house was being built for her. Though she was concerned with Solomon's brooding, even she could not shake him of it. She never doubted his love for her, even when he pulled away and seemed distant. She amused herself with her crafts, being led by her artistic gifts into bold new areas. She would travel among the street markets, examining various works from other nations and using them as inspirations for her own creations. On several occasions, she considered taking a tour of other cities to see what could be found there also, reasoning that this might allow Solomon some needed space right now. Solomon had always had a serious side, but she had never seen him so somber before. For the first time in her life, try as she might, she could not impact him, distract him, make him smile and laugh. He will come to himself, she reminded herself, remembering that, eventually, he always had. Occasionally, she wondered if it were some failing of her own that had led to his silence, but dismissed the idea. If, perchance, she did have pause to doubt his feelings for her, she need only return to the new house he was building for her, where his love for her was etched into every wall. Solomon had designed the house on the model of a vine, with rooms sprawling out gracefully from a central hallway. Its moldings were decorated with images of ripe grape clusters on leafy vines. It was elegant and beautiful. There were, however, some curious aspects to the house that were kept secret, even from Hava. Solomon had explained that the entire house, every facet, every room, was designed for some particular purpose, each of which would be revealed to her as they lived their lives together. One central chamber opened into a heptagon with 7 high walls, and the roof was of colored glass. Solomon was knowledgeable in astronomy. The room was so situated that as the sun traveled across the sky, it would cascade the room in 7 colorful hues in the order of the rainbow. Inset into the high walls were elaborate display cases and shelving made of the finest wood and metal, cedar and gold. Interesting they were, but empty. Each of the 7 walls featured a design and color scheme unique to itself, yet blending with the others. As the day moved forth, it was as though the room were alive, changing from hour to hour as the color flooded through the skylights, highlighting one surface after another, and then blending into the next color to highlight the adjacent wall. This chamber itself had taken 4 years to design, requiring careful observation and research of the sun's movements through all the seasons. The actual construction had taken 2 years, and then it was observed for 2 full solar seasons to fine-tune the many mirrors which helped cast the light. This was, then, the 5th year since the idea's conception. Solomon had begun it when he was 16 years old. It was equally marvelous at night, as the phases of the moon marched in a small circular pattern of light when observed at the same time each night. At the very peak of the chamber was a small area of clear glass, crystal, the most rare and expensive of stones, and sizable enough pieces had been found somewhere to act as windows. Through these, the 12 constellations would pass, marking the months of the year. The 4 cardinal points of the year were also marked, 2 solstices and 2 equinoxes, as a single shaft of light passed through a carefully placed ring of diamonds and illuminated shiny medallions on the opposing wall. Gold for summer, copper for fall, silver for winter, and topaz for spring. It was a wonder, a truly magnificent place, and one could sit for hours and watch the drama of light unfold, breathtaking, even while playing upon the curiously empty compartments. Hava very much liked the place, though it was obviously unfinished. Solomon called it the worship chamber. She sometimes wondered if she could add some contribution to it. The worship aspect of the chamber had been settled in consultation with the prophet Nathan, who had blessed it at Solomon's request and confirmed that its inspiration had come from God. In it were to be housed specially crafted memorabilia commemorating the 7 yearly feasts: unleavened bread, Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, weeks, trumpets, Day of Atonement, and tabernacles. The room was designed to record a life's devotion to God through these feasts, with each year's celebration marked by the placing of the carefully designed souvenirs in their predetermined locations. Each piece had already been designed, and the room so designed to receive it that once placed in its chamber, it would contribute a new harmony to the symphony of light. Pieces from the early years would be placed in the lower compartment, and as the married couple advanced in age, their memorabilia would circle up the chamber walls, blending at last into the glorious light in the pinnacle, which represented their entrance into the hand of God at life's end. Each item placed therein would summon up a sacred memory, reinforcing loving devotion to God like a tower of faithfulness, brick upon brick. If this room represented the pinnacle of worship, the whole house followed suit. There were no accidents in design anywhere. Everything had a meaning and a purpose, but the purposes could only be fulfilled through the lives of the residents of the house as husband and wife. Now, as Solomon became gloomier and the palace residents' concern for him grew, Hava began to be impressed with a sense of desperation. If she had any gift at all, she knew it was to dispel gloominess and bring joy to a situation or to a person. She found this reinforced wherever she went, for no matter where she wandered, joy and laughter were soon to follow. And she believed that there was no person to whom she was more charged to bring joy than Solomon. She began to see in his depression a failure in her own duty. She could not understand him. She had already resigned herself to that years ago. She could not meet his mind as Naamah did, nor could she ever match the stunning beauty of Kamizi. But one thing she could always do was to make him smile. She took pride in that. His apparent depression became a burden to her and a challenge. She determined not to let this thing, whatever it was, rob him of his joy. If he would no longer speak to her, she would simply scale up her effort until he had to react. The worship chamber, Hava knew, was very close to the heart of Solomon. If she presented him a gift there, he would surely respond. Solomon sat in his seat behind the bench of the judgment hall, where he was recording some final notes after a day of hearing testimony and rendering judgments. He was obsessed with justice, and nothing drew harder on his compassion than oppression of the poor. His eyes never failed to seek out the downcast, and he could identify an oppressed person in a crowd almost by the expression on their face. But the last case of the day left a bad taste in his mouth because a man called Asa Barak, whom Solomon was sure was guilty of murder, had escaped the verdict. Solomon had tried a ruse to coax a conflicting story out of the man, but had botched the order of his questions, allowing the man to see the trap just in time. Solomon was bound by the law to send the criminal to the city of refuge, an unsolved case. It was the first case in over 200 that had gone that way. He worried that his all-consuming personal issues were beginning to affect his work. It had been a bad day to begin with concern over his lack of a queen pressing upon him constantly. He had summoned Naamah for a tour of the temple grounds in hope, though a distant one, that more direct exposure would inspire in her some passion for the Israelite religion. True, the prospect of putting forth this Ammonitess as queen was fraught with political challenges, but with few other options in sight, he designed to give Naamah every opportunity to rise to it. Perhaps this time the faith of the Israelites would finally take root in her. Then her brave mind could assist him in navigating the politics of bringing her into the position of queen. Solomon had not actually taken her into the temple. That would have been unthinkable. But he did stroll with her upon the wall, attempting to engage her in conversation while pointing to its various features. Naamah, he quickly discovered, was angry and more deeply than he knew. Naamah's anger was not like that of other women, a storm that blew in, spent its fury, and disappeared. Her anger was intelligent and lasting. It found its way to the surface through stilted comments and barely discernible sarcasm. She met his overtures concerning the temple with well-stated and perfect responses, revealing a very complete understanding of the technicalities of Israelite worship. So complete, in fact, that it was entirely without soul, the product of a mind that had laboriously committed to memory things in which it had no natural interest. While Solomon continued to search for a way to pique Naamah's curiosity, she used the rare opportunity to draw his attention to her own complaints, her abode outside of the city, and the plight of the Ammonite people. Letters from the homeland continued to insist, she said, that Ammonites were being abused in the king's labor force. This very temple with which Solomon was so enraptured was, she said, to blame for the whole atrocity. She could see in it nothing but oppression. His comments on the cutting and fitting of the stones were met with complaints about who carried them. Solomon and Naamah had parted ways in a disagreeable silence. Solomon in grief, Naamah in the cold calculation of revenge. The unhappy memory of this exchange pooled with the unsatisfactory result of the final case of the day, forming a bitter brew in his soul as Solomon sat behind the judgment bench recording notes. He looked up. The still outline of a woman was in the far doorway. Hava. Hava was not often found standing statuesque, as she was just now, having the habit, rather, of always scurrying off to or from some amusement. Solomon rose, regarding curiously the beautiful woman silhouetted against the bright background. Had something happened? Had the Lord finally spoken to her? Hava, he said. She was silent. That also was odd. He descended from the bench and made his way down the central aisle to meet her. Her face was pregnant with meaning untold. I thought I might find you here, she said, purely serious, with not a hint of a smile, an expression he found strangely refreshing, contrasted as it was against her recent, almost desperate attempts to amuse him. What is it, love? Hava looked at him poignantly. There is something I must tell you. I have known that I must tell you this for some time, but have not had the courage. It is well known that you have been diverted in recent days, and I know the cause. He studied her, cocking his head to one side, even as his pulse quickened. Truly? Me, she continued. I have failed you, and I have none to blame but myself. Solomon swallowed. Is that so, my love? How do you mean? Finally, she moved, stepping in through the doorway to stand closer to him, studying his eyes sincerely. I have known what a queen must be, what a queen must do, the sacrifices she must make for her king and his kingdom. But until now, I have not been willing to make them. I have been in your presence, but I have not ventured near your heart, even when I knew the way. I should bring you joy, but instead I bring you pain. I alone have allowed you to descend into the bleakness that your soul now experiences, when I had the power to prevent it. This should never be, not between us. We've been friends too long. I failed you miserably. Hava, I intend to make it up to you, if you will allow me. Hearing now words he had longed to hear for so long, he felt nothing but the urge to console, to insist that her failing was truly not so bad, but he knew truth would not allow such a consolation. Hava, we have been friends, and there's nothing between us that we cannot amend under the right circumstances, which is exactly why I've come, she replied. Will you walk with me? A wave of compassion for her washed over him. Of course, he said, stepping forward. She turned and went back out the door, and he came up beside her, extending his arm for her to take, which she did. I have something to show you, she said, a token of my repentance, that you may know my heart is attuned to yours. He glanced at her curiously. There was still no hint of joviality in her demeanor. Come with me. She indicated the pathway before them, which wound among several gardens and palace buildings toward the site of the home under construction. After a peaceful walk of several minutes, they arrived at the entrance to the magnificent new house, and Hava stopped. A vine had been planted to the right side of the main door, a vine which Hava knew Solomon had taken an interest in, and even more so since its health was questionable. That poor vine, she commented. Yes, it is disappointing. Has it enough water? I have tended it myself. I do not know what more can be done for it. She looked up at him with honest eyes. I'm sorry. He studied her. It is only a vine, my love. It's not important. Though in itself it is only a vine, its importance cannot drop beneath that of the person to whom it matters, she replied. He nodded, regarding her curiously. Not only was it a nice sentiment, it was, in fact, the most perceptive statement he had heard from her in a long time. She met his studying eyes, perceiving his favor in them. I want to assure you that I am not blind to the deep pulses of your soul. That is why I am showing you what I have done here, that you may never doubt me again. Done? She smiled at him. Come. She took him by the hand and led him through the door. He walked with her in silent curiosity as she made her way through the home, passing through several rooms in silence toward the center, where the worship chamber was situated. There, she stopped in front of the door and turned her back to it to face him. I know this house is special to you, and no place in it more special than this room. He was nodding. Did she finally, truly understand? And so, it is here, where I have chosen to show you my repentance. I have a gift for you, and I can only give it to you here. He studied her intently, his apprehension growing. Hava, what have you done? Only my very best, and you alone are worthy of it. I give you all my very best, my best work, the fruit of my life. Hava, she put her hand on the door and slowly pushed it open, allowing him to enter. Solomon stepped forward tentatively into the room. Suddenly he gasped, his eyes roaming up and around, widely and wildly. Oh, he whispered, putting his hand to his temple. There, in the walls of the seven-sided worship chamber, which contained the many empty cases which had been both sized and designed to represent years of worship of Jehovah through the 7 feasts and holy days of the sacred Israelite calendar. There, from within those very cases, stared back at Solomon statues and sculptures in every available place, from top to bottom, in every corner. Every piece was handcrafted artwork, made and placed by Hava herself. Each was her unique handiwork and design, yet filled with visible influences and shades of every foreign god known in the world. Could it possibly be? Hava, he whispered in horror. She stared at him, trying to discern his strange reaction. Hava, what have you done? Her face went flat. I offer you Ichabod! Ichabod! Hava! This sanctuary was created for worship of Jehovah, and you have defiled it with the filth of the nations. What? Worship? Yes, worship of the one true God. Hava, these are idols. She looked up, examining her artwork in puzzlement. They are not idols, she whispered. It is just art. Does not all art belong to God? He gasped, perplexed. Art? Hava, do you not know that spirits attach themselves to certain kinds of art? Do you not know that the heathens venerate these images as their gods? God made all art, to be sure, but Belial twists it, defiling it by his filthy worship, and as long as men associate these things with Belial, it is for us unclean. Unclean! An abomination of the worst kind. Hava, how could you do this? Have you lost all sense? How could you? He stared down at her wildly. She took a step back from him in fear, placing her hand over her chest, never before having seen such a reaction from her gentle king. I, she stammered. Staring at her, Solomon let out a loud groan that was something beyond words. It echoed up into the high recesses of the chamber. He leaned toward her almost imperceptibly, then grabbed his robes in the front and tore them violently in two, the Hebrew gesture of great sorrow. Looking into his crazed pupils, Hava was suddenly afraid of him. He turned, abruptly and violently, crashed into a wall, rebounded toward the door, and stumbled out. She stepped after him and called, Solomon! Silence! Away from me! He staggered toward the door of the house, stumbling out into a run. He cleared the threshold, blurry-eyed with grief and awe at what he had just seen, and stumbled blindly back down the path along which they had just come, back toward the palace, passing before the curious eyes of palace personnel. The king labored up the stairs to his chamber and slammed the door, pulling down the locking crossbeam. Hava had followed him for a few steps and then resigned to let him go, looking in the direction he had gone and then eventually wandering back to the worship chamber to stare up in confusion at the collection of her most carefully crafted works, elegantly displayed in the room's many cases. She shook her head in bafflement and teared up. Finally, she slammed the door to the chamber in rage, causing everything in the room to shake, and stomped out the main door, slamming it in like fashion. The morning was bright, but ominous. Bathsheba quickened her pace yet again as she hastened toward the royal stable where Solomon's personal livestock was kept. She hoped she was not too late, if not for the fact that she had been informed by a palace aide that something unusual was taking place. Solomon would have slipped away without her knowing. But now the palace was abuzz with the news. The young king had called for an emergency meeting with his top advisors and had hastily set affairs in order to allow himself an unexplained leave of absence. Something was wrong. As Bathsheba rounded the back of the palace building, her eyes leaped ahead across the wide stone courtyard used for staging of chariots and, with some relief, recognized the familiar forms of the guards, Jachin and Boaz, near the stable door. They will not be far from him. She had sent messengers to call for Nathan the prophet, but Solomon was acting so quickly and decisively that she doubted he would arrive before her son had departed, leaving her to try to reason with him herself. Presently, Jachin emerged through the stable door into which he had disappeared moments earlier, leading a fine stallion, and two servants helped to hoist and tie a pack onto the wild animal. A moment later, Bathsheba recognized the unmistakable profile of her son as he emerged with Shishak, his own favorite stallion, a stunning white Arabian that had come from Pharaoh's most elite stock. She gushed a sigh of relief at the sight of him, even as she quickened her pace once again. Solomon looked up to see his mother as she made her way toward him as fast as her age and her garments would allow. She lifted her arm in a wave to catch his eye, as though such a gesture could detain him a few moments longer. Solomon turned around and gave instructions to another pair of servants as they loaded his horse with the travel pack, then pointed back into the stable at something as he gave still more directions to others. "Solomon!" Bathsheba cried as she came up to him. He turned to face his mother, and when he did, she saw a most odd expression on his face. She recognized it as a highly disciplined facade, covering deep distress. His features were gaunt beneath his bushy beard, which had grown quite shaggy in recent weeks, and he looked very tired, as if he had not slept at all the previous night. The truth was, he hadn't. He managed a polite smile and forced a calm casualness in his voice as he greeted her with the formal, "Blessings, mother." "Solomon!" she exclaimed with greater desperation in her tone, even as her voice lowered in volume. "I heard you had come down here. The reports in the palace are that you are leaving?" she ended with a question. Solomon turned to give more instructions to his aides, then straightened himself to face her. "You would leave without telling me?" she asked, searching his eyes. They seemed far away. She chanced a glance at his two guards, who revealed, by silently catching her eye, that they, too, were distraught at the present turn of events. "I have a bit of business to attend to," Solomon said simply. "Business? But where? How long? Just the three of you?" "I go to see Harum Abi," he said. The friendship that had developed between Solomon in the prince from Tyre, the incomparably skilled craftsman who was overseeing the construction of the temple, was legendary. Hiram, a most uncommon and intelligent man, had won the trust of Solomon as few men could. He was one of a rare group that could meet the king mind for mind, at least in his own field of expertise. Hiram had been gone from Jerusalem for some time to inspect another raft of logs from Tyre before export and to approve a new quarry for additional stones. Bathsheba looked around at the evidence of her son's imminent departure, not knowing quite how to react to his painfully brief and unsatisfying explanation. Her advisors had been right. The king would explain his actions to no one.
"But son, is it not unsafe to travel alone like this? Cannot messengers be sent to Huram-Abi?"
Solomon pursed his lips as he studied her. Of all of the advantages a king enjoyed, he had one decided disadvantage. He could do nothing in private. His every word and action was subjected to constant examination, a ruthless and persistent examination. Imaginative observers tagging the most mundane of actions with political intrigue. His plan for a hasty departure was his best attempt at circumventing the phenomenon, to be gone before many questions could be asked. Questions he could not answer. Following the incident with Hava the previous night, his urge had been dangerously close to a desire to flee. He had finessed it into something more acceptable, a temporary hiatus from responsibility, where he could put his full focus on the most difficult problem he had yet encountered as king. Still, a little voice told him he was running. So be it. No advisor could help him now. The cases at the judgment bar, no matter how complex, held no comparison to this, for this issue pierced his very soul. Justice demanded that his own heart now be probed, the sharp scalpel of spiritual examination poking at its most sensitive places. The bright light of discernment must now shine directly upon the excruciating conflict between himself and his presumed queen-to-be. Like an animal wishing to suffer alone, he set his face away. What to other men would have been a private matter was for him the pressing business of the kingdom. The issue had to be faced in all of its agony. That he could only do alone. "Mother," he explained, discerning her desperation, "we'll be traveling the high country, not the main roads. You know well the protection of Jachin and Boaz. Even if we do encounter anyone, it is highly unlikely that I will even be recognized," he said, opening his arms, palms up before him. She looked him over. He had in fact traded his royal garments for something much more drab and common-looking. She had to agree with him. With his shaggy beard and gaunt expression, he looked more like a beggar than a king. Outside of Jerusalem, the vast majority of Israelites had never even seen him up close. Removed from his royal entourage and traveling in a small band, it was quite likely he could go completely unnoticed.
"Son, I know something is wrong, something you are not saying. It is Hava, isn't it?"
At the sound of her name, he froze for a split second, then blinked and turned away from his mother, gaining emotional space through the feigned helping of a servant to cinch up the pack on his horse. Jachin and Boaz exchanged a glance upon hearing the queen's name spoken aloud. "After meeting Huram-Abi, we will be traveling on to Lebanon," he said. Bathsheba knew her son was extremely fond of the high and wild beauty of Lebanon, as his father David had been. As a boy, Solomon had hiked the hills of Ammana and always seemed to enjoy a spiritual renaissance in that place. Discerning that her son was not going to be deterred from his course, Bathsheba quickly rearranged her goals toward gaining as much information as possible.
I do wish you would take some time to plan and prepare before rushing off like this. The kingdom cannot be left unattended for long. When can we expect your return?
I will be back in time for Yom Kippur. My counselors have been advised, he replied. Bathsheba gaped, but only inwardly. Yom Kippur? The fall feast was over 2 months away.
But son, so long! How can the kingdom manage such an absence? There is business that must...
The kingdom has no greater business than for its king to resolve this matter. The voice came from near the stable. All heads turned to see the prophet Nathan, holding his staff, leaning against the wall as though he had been there all day. How long had he been there? All eyes were now on him, but the prophet's eyes focused only on the eyes of the king. The two stared at each other in a long moment of silence. Then, inexplicably, the prophet moved, took up his staff, and disappeared, shuffling around the corner. The moments that followed were of a most awkward silence. The 3 horses had been fully prepared, were now stomping and swishing their tails in the mid-morning sun, which suddenly seemed exceedingly bright, while the servants who had been assisting now stood nearby, awaiting further instructions. The prophet has spoken, Solomon said into the air, addressing no one in particular, and then bent his head down toward his mother. Her eyes welled as he leaned down to kiss her cheek. Then he turned, and with some vigor, swung up onto his horse. He looked at his 2 guards, who interpreted the silent command, and hastily mounted also. We will exit through the back gate, follow the canal to the Shepherd's Gate, and then head east toward the hill road through Judea, above the Jordan Valley, Solomon explained. With the help of the Lord, we will be out of the city without notice. He looked back around at his mother, who was staring up at him with fearful, tear-filled eyes. Do not be afraid, he said. Then he looked decidedly away and spurred his horse forward. Bathsheba scurried after him for a few steps. Be careful, my son. He glanced back at her and nodded. I love you, she said. He turned again and bowed slightly with his head, mouthing the words back to her. Then she was left, powerlessly watching her beloved son and his 2 guards ride across the courtyard toward the back gate, where he would disappear, perhaps as a mother's heart is always prone to fear, forever.